As a developer, and I would imagine people who work in tech in general, it's natural to think about creating new products, especially if you've maybe been working on the same thing for a while now. In those moments, it's really easy to think about how awesome it would be to build something from the ground up. Though I'm sure that's true and it would be exciting and rewarding, I highly doubt that journey is a painless one. This is a talk I'm personally very excited about. I'm willing to bet there's some great insights from having done just that. Our next presenter is someone we're very happy to welcome back to ETE and is even a member of the ETE team herself sometimes. Here to tell us about the journey of building from zero is VP of Engineering at Tomo, Audrey Trout. Take it away, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Jack, for that warm introduction. And hello, ETE. I'm very excited to be back, honored to be here. I'm Audrey Trout, for those of you I don't know, VP of Engineering at Tomo. Tomo is a startup, as Jack said. We launched on June 30th, 2021, just about 6 months after we got the team on board and built our first prototype. And that was just over 9 months ago. So I'm here today to share what we chose to invest in from the beginning, from those very first months versus what we punted for the future, some lessons I've learned along the way, and what we've added as we've grown. My goal is to give you a window into our story, not because I think we did everything right, but because I think reflecting on our experiences and sharing those learnings is what makes us all collectively better. And I can't wait to talk to you about it. So let's start with the beginning, where we all began. In my previous life, I've built new engineering teams. I've been part of launching products and I've worked on greenfield projects, but it was a new experience for me to start from a truly blank sheet of paper with no team and know that what you start and who you hire needs to form the seeds of a technology platform, a product, and an organization that everyone expects to rapidly evolve and grow into the foundation of a wildly successful technology-driven business. At Tomo, we had a clear revolutionary vision for what we needed to build. We had some of the most experienced and respected industry experts on board as our top leaders. We had maybe the largest seed round of any a company like us before. And so when it came time to found the engineering team, to start building our product, we were in a very privileged position. But where do you start? What do you insist on from the beginning? And what do you leave to figure out as you go? If you haven't been in this position before, I encourage you to pause and think about that. If you're an engineer or an engineering leader and you could start from scratch and build whatever team, whatever technology stack, whatever culture and practices you thought were best, what would you do? I'm sure many of you are sensibly saying to your screen, well, it depends on what we need to build or what problems we need to solve. And you're absolutely right. So before I tell you what we did and how it went, let me start with a little bit about our product and our mission so you can understand our early choices. First, what is Tomo, right? Tomo exists to build the future for how homes are bought. And we're starting with how home purchases are financed, so mortgages, because that's the greatest source of pain and stress in most people's home buying journeys. Anyone who has bought a home recently probably knows what I'm talking about. When I tell people about Tomo and I find out that they recently bought a house, I ask them, what one word would describe your home buying experience? And no one has ever said joyful. But that's our idea, that the process of home buying and even the financing part can be a joyful experience. But Tomo's not a bank. We're what's called a correspondent lender. So we actually do originate loans, and we can also connect home buyers with a great real estate agent if they need one. So from a high level, on an engineering and product perspective, what we set out to build starting in about December 2020 was a great digital experience for home buyers so they can apply for a loan and get a mortgage. And then all the plumbing and tooling internally so that we can do the work to potentially connect those home buyers with expertly prepared humans when needed, and also to process and underwrite and originate and close loans in a way that's never been done before in the industry to make this whole process transparent, predictable, less expensive, and even joyful. So what did we decide on from the very start? The CTO, Dan Koch, and I made the decision to hire a foundational team of super senior engineers to start. My thinking is when you have a lot to learn, when you're really starting from scratch, and you want to figure a lot out in the hurry, it helps to have a senior team so that you can send everyone out to tackle big open questions in parallel, to do discovery and find solutions, and know that they have the right experience and instincts for how to make everything come back together into a coherent whole that we then can continue to build on. With me in Philly and our CTO, Dan, in Seattle, we knew we were going to build a distributed engineering team. Although we did work hard to hire as many engineers as we could around Seattle, where our product and design partners would be based. But even before 2020, I was not new to leading remote engineering teams, and I was really happy to plant the seeds of the kind of culture and practices that I knew we'd need to collaborate asynchronously and learn a lot together and build relationships across time zones. On the technical side, an easy starting assumption was that we'd use AWS as our cloud provider because it would work for what we needed and we had a lot of expertise there. And then for what we needed to build, we knew we were going to build some kind of web-based experience, right? So we're going to need a web client. We knew that to be able to show mortgage rates and get home buyers started on a loan application, we need to integrate with several third-party APIs. And these are not fantastic APIs. A lot of fintech partners that you're working with, this is a lot of clunky APIs that deal in XML and things like that. But we need to integrate with them because we have to do things like soft credit checks or query for current market rates. And that will need to sync a lot of data between systems, like having our customer relationship management software, our CRM, for example, and our loan origination system. So we would also definitely need to implement a lot of business logic and financial calculations. So likely in some backend services for things like calculating your debt to income ratio and what your maximum qualifying loan amount could be. We knew from the start that the work of processing a mortgage application is very stateful, right? It's a discrete deterministic process at the end of the day. It's very workflowy. And it's not super time sensitive, aside from the need to be responsive to a human that's interacting with the client. And we're also never going to be handling billions of transactions per second or anything, because even in this hot real estate market, right, people don't buy homes that quickly. And of course, we need to store very sensitive information, like people's social security numbers and financial information, in a responsible way. So there's no room for taking shortcuts with data and infrastructure security. Overall, though, with these first assumptions, we made it clear that for whatever decisions we made after that, we're going to optimize for speed of development and flexibility so that we could rapidly evolve our product and technology. Because at this point, when we're just starting out, we had no idea what we were really going to need down the road. We're just getting started, and we wanted to be able to iterate and to learn as fast as possible. So we hired a foundational team and had some pretty big decisions to make together right off the bat, including languages, frameworks, data stores, overall system architecture, CI/CD, and even how we structure our repos. For those first decisions, we started with architecture. While we wanted to keep things simple, we had an intuition from the start that a microservices architecture was going to make the most sense. For example, we could already see the value of having a mortgage service that manages the state of a mortgage application and handles that main pre-approval flow versus keeping the logic and math around rate quotes and max qualifying loan amounts in a separate quote service. We knew that all these third-party vendors that we're using, these third-party APIs for things like credit checks, that we might want to swap those out over time. And so we plan to take the approach of creating wrapper services around those third-party API integrations as much as possible. For languages and frameworks, this was one of the hardest decisions to make. I hired the whole foundational engineering team without a specific language in mind, which meant that as a team, we had a spread of experience across C#, Elixir, Java, Ruby, Go, Python. There was no common language among us at all, but we had the most overlap in Go and Python. I actually declared one week in December as Tech Stack Decision Week, and for some teammates, it was their first week at Tomo. We spent time looking at those starting assumptions and then building a case for the backend language and framework combination that we thought made the most sense. And then we had a debate, and in the end, a decision needs to get made. And so the CTO and I made the call. We went with Python because it had the most to offer. Our team had some familiarity with it, although none of us were experts. We're all quite senior. You can adapt and you can learn. We felt confident that we could attract more engineering talent in the future to work in this language, in addition to working on our amazing product. And there are ample open source and industry tools and libraries so that we wouldn't have to spend our precious time building utilities for things like wrangling all that XML that we were going to get for those third-party APIs before we could build Tomo's core functionality, those things that only we could do. And the language itself would enable sufficient balance of flexibility and expressivity and robustness in our Tomo code. As for Python's weakness, one of them potentially being performance, we discounted that because since much of our backend work isn't, again, about high velocity computations, but more standard piping and management of data and serving various clients. If a need were to arise for a more performant backend language, we agreed that Golang would be our default choice. And that's what we used when we ended up building our auth service, for example. For front-end language and frameworks, it was a little easier. We made our very first prototype in Vue.js, but due to a deeper team expertise and better tooling for what we needed, we went with a React Redux app written in JavaScript with an eye on potentially moving to TypeScript in the future, which we did. We did do a few months later. For our data storage needs, we opted to use managed services to minimize the overhead of standing up and maintaining these tools while also getting out of the box kind of standard monitoring and security and things like that. We thought a relational database would probably be appropriate for our needs, for managing that kind of state of a mortgage application. But we didn't see value in having to spend time hosting our own databases. So we aligned on using Aurora and Postgres. And for file storage, since we're on AWS, it's like, sure, we'll use S3 if we need that. We all agreed that we didn't want to or need to manage anything lower level than containers for hosting our services. As for container management services, we chose EKS and Fargate to further simplify our management and scaling for our clusters. And to deploy and manage our environments and our infrastructure, we decided to go with what we consider an industry standard, Terraform. We didn't have an SRE team to start, and we knew that this decision would require us to build more familiarity with Terraform than what we had going in. But we believed that this decision would pay off in the long run because we'd be able to spin up complete environments for development and testing and iterate a lot more quickly, which it definitely did. For monitoring, we chose Datadog as our tool for monitoring and alerting. I mean, there's a lot of options out there. Datadog's great, works for our needs, and we're really familiar with it. We didn't really do much with Datadog from the start, and I'm going to reflect on that in a few minutes, but we did plug it in, plugged it into our clusters, into our applications as we built them. And for source control and CI/CD, we went with GitHub because it was popular and familiar, of course, with the team. And one of our teammates stood up a little concourse instance for CI and the start of some simple make-based scripts for how we build and test things locally and in CI. And we kind of started a mono repo by default because our project began as a little demo of one client and one service. And we found as we worked that it was easiest to keep that all together, to collaborate around making those changes within one mono repo. This decision to use a mono repo turned out to be one of those decisions that we still question from time to time, even today. Unlike mono repos, though, one thing we didn't question is that we were going to do continuous delivery. The idea of doing scheduled releases and the idea of iterating and learning quickly and moving at the speed we knew we needed to move, just those don't go together. Continuous delivery is a forcing function to make the investments and to take responsibility for making it safe to deploy main at any time, and for making our business stakeholders comfortable with that too. And if you don't start with continuous delivery, in my previous experience, it's an uphill battle to get there. So we built it in from day one, and I have no regrets. Large and small changes go out multiple times per day at Tomo, and we rarely break things. And when we do, we know, and we fix them. Collective ownership, on the other hand, turned out to be a more challenging concept for some of our engineers. Actually, none of our core operating principles have gotten pushback in the early days or now, except for this one. Some engineers would really love to own a system or a code base and care for it and feed it and make it awesome. I held fast to this principle of collective ownership, though. We had a lot to build. We still do. And we couldn't afford to have specialists or form bottlenecks. We needed everyone to be able to take ownership of whatever opportunities needed to be tackled next. And while there are potential pitfalls to collective ownership, like everyone owning quality is the same as no one owning quality, or you're going to end up with poorly defined interfaces between systems. We felt like the flexibility was worth the risk, and we could mitigate those risks because of the incredible team that we had and the culture and practices that we were building. Speaking of culture and practices, an important belief that is core to all of Tomo, and not just engineering, is that we value people over process. We trust each other to do the right thing, and we chafe against the status quo a little bit. That isn't to say that we wouldn't have structure to how we work. In fact, if you could go back a year and visit the engineering team, you'd see a pretty standard Scrum process with a backlog and epics and spikes and refinement and estimates and a roadmap and planning and demos and retros. We use each of these practices because they worked for us. And when they weren't working, we would change them. It was also really delightful that from the beginning at Tomo, trust and transparency were a big part of our company culture, and not just what we said, but how we actually worked. We're setting out to revolutionize an industry, after all, which is something you can't do without being willing to take some risks and questioning how things have been done before. So with those principles and all of these kind of first technical decisions in place, we made our little proto-Tomo, our prototype, and we then had a repo that we could work on together and get started, merging changes in and deploying them to our staging environment at any time. So we were off and running, and it was time to build Tomo. Oh, this phase of our engineering journey is a bit of a thrilling blur. With time, we did find our stride. We figured out and understood what we wanted to build for a launch. We also put a date on the calendar, and we said, we are launching June 30th, 2021. And that was only 6 months away from, again, when we got the engineering team all together. Aside, we did actually want that to be April 1st originally. That was our original idea. And I had to be the one to raise my hand from engineering and say, there is no way that we can build everything we need to build and integrate and onboard all the partners we need by then, let alone stand up the rest of a mortgage business. So June 30th it was. We were moving fast, but we would also stick our heads up every week to see where we were and what we needed to do before launch. Those of you who are familiar with the iron triangle know that if you pin time on the calendar, you only have certain only flex points that you can use, namely scope, cost, and if you believe in the iron pyramid, quality. So scope, cost, and quality. That's where you have to flex, and we did. We cut scope, and cut scope, and cut scope again until we got down to the absolute essentials of what we needed to build. And it hurt. It hurt sometimes, but we did it. And spoiler, it turns out that we didn't need all of those features that we loved so much or that we thought were so important. You know, we launched without them. And I can tell you in hindsight, it ended up just fine. So we did a lot of scope cutting. We also flexed on the cost point. We spent on contractors to build things outside of our core technology stack, like our public website, for example, that we didn't have time to build for launch. And you could also say that we flexed on quality too. We took some intentional debt to get everything built, not in terms of writing poor quality code or creating a poor user experience, but by building with more specificity and less flexibility. In some places, we ended up building something that worked for today. It was going to work for launch, but we knew that it wouldn't work for the long term. It's too specific. It's too rigid. But it was worth it, because until we launched, this whole thing was just a hypothesis. The technology platform and the engine we built, the experience we gave homebuyers, what questions we asked in what order, and whether we could make home buying joyful, period, the whole thing. It was more important to get something working that we could start to learn from, actually supporting customers and learning from that experience. It was more important to do that than to build a perfectly generic and flexible engine that would suit any and all future needs. One of the smartest things we did is get our SRE team on board long before launch. Before that, it was taking one or more engineer per sprint to wrangle CI and Terraform and Fargate or AWS permissions to keep development moving forward as we were adding more services and capabilities to our product. And what the SRE team did was a couple things. They started out by leveling up our terraforming. We moved our Terraform code to a standalone app so that we could add in Atlantis. Atlantis does Terraform pull request automation, if you're not familiar with it. This also gives us some future proofing for compliance, right? It increases the auditability of our infrastructure changes and ensures that everyone is following best practices for only committing after applying changes. We also added TerraGrunt, which is a thin wrapper around Terraform that helps with enforcing best practices again and ensuring code reuse. And this makes it easy altogether for engineering to do the right thing, even as we scale and even as we add more developers that are less familiar with Terraform. Another change we did was level up our source control in CI, and we moved away from GitHub to GitLab and GitLab pipelines. The thinking was that this would give us better pipeline status out of the box, better cancel retry, give us better progress visibility in the context of our MRs. But really, on the whole, too, it was going to be easier for our SRE team to manage for us, and gave us some additional future proofing all at once, which was to be able to provision users with the SCIM and log in with SAML, single sign-on basically, and again, giving us better auditing ability about who approved and shipped what and when. Our SRE team also helped us set up environments. We needed to have not just staging, but of course production. You can't go to production if you don't have a production. We needed to set up a lot of our AWS accounts to make that all possible and clean up a lot of debt around Route 53 and IAM roles and candidly a lot of ClickOps, although we had tried to use Terraform as we were going at the speed that we were moving. We had some tech debt around ClickOps that we had to clean up as well. And so thanks to our SRE team making this investment, we now could cleanly stand up and provision environments end to end with everything that we needed. For our container management, we actually moved away from EKS and Fargate and over to Rancher. EKS and Fargate were absolutely the right choice for us in the early days to get Tomo moving, especially without a ton of Kubernetes expertise on the team. But with the SRE team being on board, we wanted to move over to Rancher to give us better management around cost, containing cost and customization and compliance and things like that. As a bonus, it also allows us to upgrade our clusters at a slightly faster cadence compared to what the AWS release cycle has historically been. Something I hadn't thought to do that our SRE team did in these pre-launch days was to move us from AWS's US East 1 environment over to US West 2. And the idea wasn't so much that this is closer to the states where we were going to be launching first, which it was, but it was more for the overall infrastructure stability, that as a whole, this region would get just as good product release cadence from AWS, and the pricing was just as good, while having a slightly better track record for, let's say, time between major outages. And knock on wood, when US East 1 went down in fall of 2021, after we had gone live, I was really grateful to be in US West 2 at that time. And knock on wood, knock on wood, knock on wood, things continue to be stable to this day. Another piece that they added is we realized that we had a real reason to introduce serverless functions into our tech stack for the features that we were building leading up to launch. And it was wonderful having the SRE team on hand to make this a lot easier to do cleanly from the start, including how we do local development and deployments and managing permissions and all of that. And while all of this is happening, the engineering team was doing incredibly hard work to tackle one challenge after another, to build smooth and transparent end-to-end mortgage experiences for home buyers. There were explosions of complexity as we got deeper into parsing and interpreting credit reports, or how to estimate fees, or the cyclical nature, and this one is really surprising, but it's how your debt to income ratio informs how much house you can afford, which informs the loan amount that you can get, which impacts the rate that you can qualify for, which can impact how much house you can afford based on your debt to income ratio, which then can again change the interest rate you qualify for. We had to learn and figure out so much about mortgages, about home buying. And as a team, we debated fiercely, and we did spikes, and we built things, and we struggled, and we demoed, and we had fun. And as I said before, looking back, it's almost a blur. But it was thrilling to be surrounded by such thoughtful, collaborative, and skillful engineers and product and design and business partners too on that journey. And we launched. We launched, and I'm proud of many things about what we've built at Tomo, but one of the shining proud moments is that our big production launch was such a non-event. It was like 10:30 a.m. Pacific time on what I think was a Wednesday, and we pressed a button and Tomo was live. And we got some good press, and the first customers came in, and it all just worked. We had tested the end-to-end flow, not just of our application code, but the whole process, and we knew it was going to work, and it did. Reflecting back on that, there are a few things from an engineering perspective that I would do differently leading up to launch again. First, we all know that cute names aren't cute, and for the most part, and things in our code base do have clear descriptive names. But there are a few exceptions from that, from the earliest day. Our whole mono repo, for example, to this day is still called codes with an S, because the first developer named it that on a whim. And I still have to explain that to new hires from time to time. And for a long time, our mortgage service was called Service One because it was the first service that we created. And those names, they are so easy to change when there's only 6 of you, and it's a lot more expensive to change after layers of tooling and tests and documentation have been built on top of it. So no cute names. Second, I mentioned earlier when I talked about how we picked Datadog for monitoring and alerting that, we set it up, we had it plugged in, but we actually set up our monitors and alerting shortly before launch. Right? We didn't take time to set up that specific alerting around critical issues until late in the game. And while I don't think you can really tune your performance benchmarks until you're in prod with real prod traffic, I do think we could have started earlier with setting up the monitors for the health of critical functionality. The things that would be obvious that a customer wouldn't be able to get through the flow or was having a really bad time. The reason we didn't might have something to do with this next point. I wish I had pushed harder to build the end-to-end experience first, even if it was just a happy path. Our approach instead was to wait until we really understood the requirements and edge cases around each step of the home buying journey before moving on to the next step, like your credit check and calculating your monthly debt versus taking your income information and calculating your debt to income ratio versus syncing data between our main platform and our CRM and our loan origination system. As I mentioned before, these steps had a tendency to bloom in complexity, and we'd have to go in and figure out what parts of this are really essential for launch. And this meant that the end-to-end flow came together a little over a month before launch. And on top of that, then, once having an end-to-end flow, we then could only build out our end-to-end testing very late. And that end-to-end UI testing, along with the monitoring, could have definitely helped us iterate and move more quickly and confidently if we had invested in those sooner. On a similar note, we came up with the agreement I talked about using debt responsibly or to trade some flexibility for speed. We really only came up with that in the last 3 months before launch. Before that, in the early days, while we were untangling those gnarly product requirements, engineering spent time building some cool flexibility and dynamic configurability into both our front end and back end code. But in a minute, you're going to hear me talk about how the product flexibility we thought we were going to need in those early days didn't end up being the same as what we actually needed. And I don't think there's a way to perfectly anticipate the flexibility you're going to need in your application and your system design up front, but I do think going back in time and pushing to build that end-to-end experience as quickly as possible, and then working to keep it working as you learn and as it evolves, I think it's possible to avoid building more flexibility than we needed if we had done that. And finally, I mentioned before that in terms of the iron triangle and fixing the time, we flexed on cost. We used outside contractors to build things outside of our core tech platform that we didn't have time to build. One thing I regret is that we weren't more opinionated about the coding standards and deployment practices and tooling for those contractor projects. we were busy. I mean, we were busy building toward launch, and we trusted the contractors that we partnered with to make reasonable choices, and they did. It's not that anything that they built was wrong or bad, but it didn't end up aligning with our emerging coding standards and tools and processes that we were using internally, which is a price we had to pay after launch as we took over responsibility internally for those projects. But overall, honestly, we were in really good shape. And while there are things I would have changed, there are other things I wouldn't, like that we did nimbly and quickly make decisions, that everyone was so quick to put down what they're doing and help each other when someone got stuck, that we learned so much together, that we did build a working end-to-end mortgage business in 6 months. And we worked, above all, in engineering, we worked at a pace that was sustainable, so that except for, I'm going to say, maybe the last 2 weeks before launch, we worked normal hours and engineers still took vacations, and it wasn't a big deal at all. So the big push for launch was over. But what comes after that is a different kind of push, the push for growth. As an aside, yesterday Linda Rising said if you can't go outside and walk under the trees, that we should look at pictures of green things while at work, because it makes us happier and healthier and helps us think better. So I hope my slides are helping. But I like gardening a lot. And if you like gardening like I do, you'll know that sometimes as things grow, you need to cut them back to promote growth in the right areas. And you also need to move things to a bigger pot, or even divide plants so that they can continue to thrive. And that's what we did. For teams, we split. We were one engineering team all the way up through launch. And after launch, we split into 3 different product development teams. Now, sticking to the principle of collective ownership, we split teams not by service or app or layer of the application stack or feature, but by problems to solve and audiences to serve, as in serving home buyers as an external audience, or our internal team members and the tooling that they need to do their jobs. Within that, teams are empowered to change any code or any system and introduce whatever they needed to solve the problems that they're responsible for. And we got lucky with a lull. Speaking of teams, there was a lull in COVID times just after we launched there in July. And we were actually able to fly everyone out to Seattle so that we can meet face to face and kick off these new teams and plan our OKRs and roadmaps and things like that, which was really, really awesome. Speaking of planning, of course, splitting into multiple teams meant that we had to learn lightweight ways to collaborate across product and design and engineering, and with our mortgage teammates and marketing teammates and data science teams too. And now that we were live, we took on a weekly cadence as team leaders for reviewing our business metrics and sharing updates on our upcoming feature releases and product changes and operational changes. And for the most part, we've evolved it a lot, but we still use this practice to this day. We also improved our testing and tools. In order to keep our velocity up while we worked in parallel, we needed to invest more in our tooling for things like our local development environments and how we run testing and builds and how we create new services. We had made a lot of things just work for pre-launch when we were a small, super senior team of expert users, and that was fine. That was okay. But bringing new engineers on board now, especially those who were earlier in their career, meant that we had to take time to smooth out the dev experience and make it easy to do the right thing. One example is we created service archetypes using cookie cutter. So now if you need to create a new Python service or a new serverless function, you can use that. It will quickly generate a new service for you, and it'll follow all the established patterns for CI and for testing, and you could deploy it to staging right away. We also added feature environments, so you could exercise feature branches in a staging-like environment before merging them to main, because of course, once something goes to main, it's ready to go live. We overhauled our hastily developed end-to-end UI tests, which we had created prior to launch to kind of give us that broad coverage. But we wanted to introduce a proper framework to those UI tests so that we could keep building sustainably and maintaining those, make them a lot less expensive to maintain. And then after that, we built out our integration testing frameworks so that we could shift a lot of that coverage from the kind of hastily built end-to-end UI tests down into a lot much more faster and robust code level integration tests too, to give us that same coverage with a lot more speed and reliability. Just after launch, we also did our first internal hackathon. We call it Shake-a-palooza because one of our Tomo values is shake it up. But the idea is to both give engineers a break after the big push to launch, and also create space for thinking about, from tooling and testing and product perspective, better tools, better practices, and product opportunities that we hadn't realized before. And this is still something we try to do at least twice a year. And since security and responsible data stewardship was something that we had prioritized from the beginning, we had pretty solid practices in place from launch, but it wasn't formalized into any sort of strict policies. So in this time period, as part of our growing maturity as a company, with real customers, real data to protect, we started to introduce formal policies for how we handle data and how we secure our systems and how we vet and integrate third-party services and vendors. And with all of this, all of these decisions and additions that we're making, to this day, we are still optimizing for speed of learning and flexibility. But I bet you're wondering about tech debt. As I said before, we leverage debt to get to launch, and we all know that at some point the bill comes due. And after you launch, you also learn a lot about your product and your customers and your business that you didn't know before. You couldn't know before. And so even if you didn't take on debt to build a system or a feature, you might find that what you built yesterday doesn't meet your needs today. That's a kind of debt too. Our approach to managing debt and closing the gap between what we have and what we need is in two parts. First, of course, is to clean as we go, right? We make ongoing improvements as part of our day-to-day engineering work. This is just good hygiene, right? But second, we carefully and strategically plan engineering-driven investments in building what we need for tomorrow. And we've secured the buy-in from our partners and stakeholders that these projects are valuable and important to prioritize. But this alignment, this did not happen overnight or automatically. In fact, it started with the tension I'm sure you've all experienced before between engineering and product leaders when trying to prioritize product work against engineering improvements. But we really challenged ourselves in engineering to hone in on the most meaningful improvements we could make, to scope them carefully and clearly articulate how these investments are essential for what we need to build next for Tomo. And we did it. We completed 2 significant refactoring projects within 6 months of launching. One for how we built our front-end layouts, and another that fundamentally changed the rules engine that's at the core of our mortgage service. In both cases, we had designed systems to give us flexibility and speed of development, but with time, we realized that we didn't actually have the flexibility where we needed it, and it was slowing us down. Both projects were complex. They took weeks to complete, and we collaborated across teams to get them done, but both have also paid off big time. And I wish I had made up this name, but it was actually one of our co-founders that said it. She said something like, if this is tech debt, this is the best debt I've ever seen. This is more like an investment in building our technology platform. And so we call them strategic platform investments. Another concept that emerged as we grew into multiple teams is something I call eventual coherence. It's like eventual consistency for your database, but instead it's about your architecture and your code. If you think about it, it's really common in big mature companies to have a standard and sometimes strict menu of service types or platforms or practices that you can use to build new products. And of course, there's a great benefit to having consistency of coding practices and tooling and architecture, especially in an engineering organization with a philosophy of collective ownership. But we are so young as a company, and we don't have well-established patterns for building or doing everything that we're going to need to build and do yet, right? And if we wait to align on a direction across all teams before we implement anything, we will run out of money long before we can deliver anything remarkable to our customers. We have to have a bias for action and experimentation so that we can move and learn as fast as possible. But then again, you also don't want to end up with 100 reinventions of the wheel to maintain, because that will bankrupt you too. So eventual coherence, or eventual architectural coherence, is the new use debt responsibly. It means that it's okay to try something new and use your judgment as independent teams to decide what technology, what approach, or what architecture makes sense for this need and for Tomo more generally. And then afterward, take the time to look at how our systems and practices have evolved and consider if this should stay and be used again, or if we should go back and take a different approach before building further in this direction. Part of what makes strategic platform investments and eventual coherence work is our culture of transparency and anticipation of what our teammates will need to know. For transparency, for example, we have a bias for public Slack channels and leveraging asynchronous updates so that anyone can follow along with a team or a project, which works really well because our engineers, of course, are spread across 4 time zones. We have a wiki too, of course, and I make it a priority for our department to maintain that so that important information is both searchable and discoverable. But knowledge sharing goes far beyond Slack and wikis and documents. So I introduced 2 knowledge sharing practices as soon as we split into multiple teams. One is engineering guilds and another is design review meetings. The guilds are where we meet across teams with people who work in similar areas of the stack to align on local architecture and practices and tools. And because this is all we needed, we just have 2. We have a front-end guild and a back-end guild. It's the guilds that actually came up with our first strategic platform investment projects and organized the work for getting them done across teams. Design review, on the other hand, is where we meet across teams to review upcoming and past architecture decisions and talk about needed improvements. The agenda for these meetings is driven by structured proposals, which they live on afterwards as ADRs or architecture decision records. Design review is explicitly not a place to get approval or rejection for your proposals or your architecture, but it's instead a forum of your peers to share knowledge with and get feedback on your designs. So with these hard-earned improvements and these cultural practices that we've honed, and of course the incredible people that I'm so lucky to get to work with every day, we've accomplished something that some product engineering organizations never managed to do: to maintain speed and agility and a high bar for quality and an open, cohesive, and fun culture as you double in size and double again. So how's it going? Pretty good. Pretty great, actually. With our recent A round, we more than doubled our valuation, which is only 9 months since launching, is kind of incredible. This and the traction that we found with home buyers and the fact that we're still iterating and learning quickly on top of the technology platform that we've created is really satisfying validation that we're on the right track. And that's the harvest. That's the harvest of those early seeds that we planted, but it's not the end, because just like a harvest, the cycle continues, and we're already digging in on what is next. So what is next? I can't tell you everything, but it's doing it again at a new scale. That's what's next. We just added a 4th team. We're not done growing, but to keep optimizing for speed of learning and flexibility at yet another new scale, we need to distribute decisions, for example, because eventually you hit a scale where the same small group of leaders can't be on for every decision. This means going beyond trusting teams to own problems to getting comfortable letting teams figure out what problems needed to be solved. And as we mature and grow again, so should our tools and practices around how we manage data and control access to systems. I call this security maturity. We are never done with that. We also need to continuously prepare our dev tools for tomorrow, to make appropriate investments in our builds and testing and automation to keep up with the increasing rate of change of our systems while maintaining a high bar for quality. We can't do that if the overhead of flaky tools or fragile code or a noisy on-call or frequent manual tasks, right? We need to ruthlessly automate and make the right thing to do the easy thing to do. And we'll keep making strategic platform investments and revisiting our past architecture decisions to achieve eventual coherence. But above all, we need to keep taking big, bold steps toward the future, one step at a time. And that's what it's like, building from zero. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey.
Thanks, John.
I'll say we can give it a second here. There are no questions right now, a few comments. so far, both from Sujan, and I agree with both of them. Love hearing that what matters to Tomo or smart engineers, not necessarily their experience with the specific stack,
Yeah,
platform, or tools, and scope cutting for the win. And those are both points I heavily agree with there, Sujan.
definitely. Thanks.
Oh, and Sujan just asked, how did you keep the team aligned on goals and priorities when you're moving fast?
Oh, that's a great question. All right, I'm gonna pop this down. How do you keep the teams aligned when things are changing really quickly? I don't have a magic solution for this. I'm very scrappy with documents, and there is something about, I mentioned like there's that process that we use, and having things like sprint planning where we have a clear focus for every sprint to say like, okay, here's where we are, and by the way, remember this is the map, this is the road to where we're going, this is the piece that we're doing right now, and this is what comes next. Looking at that, keeping that up to date, which was a lot of freaking work. And this is like spreadsheets and wiki pages, people. I'm not using any magic tool for this, but it's having the discipline to give to pull together succinct updates like that for the team at planning, and doing the same thing at the end of the sprints where we closed everything out and we would do demos and we would check in on like, okay, well, how did we do against our plan? It was a lot a lot of work on a lot of really kind of simple touch points, simple visualizations, made out of things like a spreadsheet and a bunch of wiki pages to kind of keep us on the same page.
Nice. Drew to Carm asks, how did you go about finding those smart engineers?
Oh man, I feel so lucky. Honestly, we did use some outs. We didn't have recruiters, and that we didn't have a people team when I first started. We had to do a lot of our own hiring. We used an outside recruiter that Dan Koch and I had worked with previously in Seattle. Her name's Sabrina Hilton. She was awesome. Who helped us really find the majority of the early team, and we were really lucky to have some organic applicants as well who had discovered Tomo. I mean, there was some news about us in our original seed fundraising round, that there were some startup-y kind of folks that had kind of heard about us in Seattle that came in too. But yeah, the combination of that, honestly, we got really lucky between that and like tapping our networks of engineers to hire and grow the team that we've had a lot of great success building an incredible team those early days, and since then. So we are hiring too. I have to say that.
I'm actually not sure why Drew asked that. He already has a very smart teammate. Me and Drew are on the same. Me and Drew are on the same project right now. That's it. Martin Snyder asks, where does the start of the pandemic fall on this timeline? And had that already happened?
That had already happened. Here? Yeah. So I started at Tomo in November 2020. So, we had been at home for a long time. So this Tomo was created from home, from everybody's homes. Our two co-founders, all the leaders and all the teams that we built, we have offices today, but we didn't go into those offices until July 2021, right? Like that, it was a long time where we were working remotely, but we made it work. It was wonderful that we were able to build those relationships and do the learning, at that rate. Obviously, there's great benefits to having an office to go to, especially for your mortgage operations and call centers and product and people and all of those things, and engineering and product and design too. But we were all at home.
Nice. Got a few more people typing here, so wait a little bit to see if that turns into some questions. If not, we can wrap things up here. Oh, Sujan asked, how did you answer questions about estimates, i.e. when is feature X going to be completed? Even in agile processes, that question comes up often.
Sujan, I gotta tell you, I'm doing it right now for the next thing that we're launching. My model for this is, it's like the cone of uncertainty, right? You have to start with something. So I actually made, it was a Gantt chart, and I colored it like a rainbow, and we called it Rainbow Road. And it was based on our high level understanding of what those big chunks were, right? The big things that we needed to solve. There's like credit and liabilities, there's syncing between systems, there's the nurture communication, all the things that we needed to do, where there were dependencies, mapping those out. But it's all wrong, of course. Like, that doesn't end up being the actual schedule for how you deliver things, but it is useful, right? It's useful because you can see, like, based on what we know right now, that one's a long pull. What can we do to cut scope there? What can we do to de-risk that from an implementation perspective? And then you use that conversation to kind of inform your plans. And as you get closer to implementation, you do that pass yet again. Like, oftentimes you go to pick up an epic and you do those spikes and you put an implementation plan together and you add it all up and you go, wow, that's a lot bigger than even I anticipated. And then you have to do this process again of saying, what is it that's making this so long? Is there scope that we can cut? So in terms of like being on time, like nothing was on, like, spoiler, nothing was on time. Nothing was on time, but we had to make the decisions for what done was. And we had to keep an eye on getting all the way to launch and seeing things finish. And that's where, I took the work of updating that Rainbow Road scrappy Gantt chart, just to make sure that we weren't setting ourselves up, for failure, for missing our launch date. I hope that answered your questions. Yeah.
Drew DeCarm asked, how many times have you guys completely thrown something out and abandoned something? And when did you decide that it was the time to do that?
Oh, so many times, right? Like at every possible stage, we've thrown things out, right? From the very early days of like what are we going to do? What does done look like? What is it that we're delivering, right? And there's like very early, like, okay, no, that doesn't make sense for the business. From a product's perspective, you get in there and you have this vision for what the customer experience is going to look like and all the features are going to be involved. And that's where you pin that date on the calendar and you have to say, we got to cut something, right? And then you look at those and you say, which one of these is not essential? That one, out it goes, right? From an engineering perspective, you get into that spike, or you start to do some of that design thinking. We're like, what do we think we need? And there are definitely times when we didn't, and that's why we had those strategic platforms investments that we did. But there are times when we did. We would open something up and we would do a spike, and we'd be like, okay, this is what we could do. It would work this way, and we're going to build that. And then we look at it and we go, no, we don't need this right now, right? This is more complexity. This is more flexibility than we need, and we check out that idea. And there are times when we've built things. We built some things for launch, some features for launch that we launched it, and customers, home buyers were using it, and we realized, well, that's not working, and we ripped it back out again. So I think throwing things out is it happens on every front all the time. And if it's not, then I think you're doing it wrong.
Mort Goldman asked, how did you build domain knowledge of the mortgage/lending business? Hire people who already knew versus training what worked best?
Oh gosh, yeah. For engineering, for product and engineering, I would say, and design, none of us had deep, like fintech experience or mortgage or real estate experience. And so we all had to learn a ton. Did it work well? I think it worked well. Would it have helped if we had inside experts on the team? Yes. But even though we didn't, what we did have is our business counterparts, our business stakeholders were incredibly deeply expert in their field. So for everything that we didn't know, we had a ready partner that was able to explain the subtle nuances of the secondary market, and how do interest rates really work, and Fannie and regulations and ECOA and underwriting. Like, we had expert teammates that would drop everything to come over and help us understand whatever it is that we needed to understand. So my take, learning from this, is that I think it's okay to start and to build a team in a domain that you don't necessarily know, but it's so long as you have a close collaborator, a close partner that is going to be able to fill that knowledge gap for you. Because the business, like Tomo, the startup, absolutely needed that expertise, but I think it worked okay for us to build that expertise and learn it over time in engineering.
Awesome. Martin Snyder asked, what does your product team look like? How does the size compare with engineering?
Oh, yeah. So our product team is super senior product team. Not surprising. That was kind of our general approach. So they're product directors. They're deeply experienced product leaders, we have one for each team. So when we were one team, when we were one engineering team, we had one product director. And of course, we had, an SVP, like a product leader, up at the top. But so we were kind of like 6-to-1, 7-to-1 as we got a little bigger toward the end there. When we split into multiple teams, each team had a product director, and then we started to, just like we've done in engineering, filling in engineering levels. So we're no longer a super senior engineering team. Like we have early career, brand new, fresh out of boot camp engineers, and we have our super senior engineers too. Product did something similar where we're starting to hire frontline product managers who are earlier in their career too, and they work as teams. So an engineering team, right, it's like 6-7 people, might have a product director and a product manager that are kind of working in that area, in that problem domain that they're owning. We also have a dedicated designer as well. I know you didn't ask about that, but I think it's important too. Every team, because we hold teams responsible for owning those problems, like for understanding them, for designing the solution, for building it, for shipping it, right? Like they're responsible for that. So they need to have a dedicated product and design and engineering leader, and the team that can actually build it, a full stack team that can do everything that's required. Yeah.
Rob Surratt, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. How did you balance not only growing the product, but the engineers as well?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Rob. And I think, Rob, growing engineers is very important to me. Something that I did, from the very early days, and I posted a link about this on LinkedIn a little while ago, was build out our engineering levels. So I think in terms of growth for engineers, it's really helpful you have to have a framework. It's really hard to grow in a vacuum when you're like, I don't know what's expected of me. I don't know what I could be doing that I'm not. So I invested the time, very early, this was pre-launch, in defining a rudimentary kind of engineering level. We only had 3 dimensions, but it kind of gave a framework for what it looks like to be, an early engineer or a trusted contributor, or someone who's ready to be a feature leader versus a team leader versus a platform leader. So the first thing is having that scaffolding in place. But that's not enough by itself. I'm sure you all know, like having a rubric doesn't make your career growth happen. And the second part of that is it's people, right? It's one-on-ones. Like even when things are busy, even when we're in the rush to launch and there's a lot going on and a lot that we're learning, and that is incredibly important that we get to launch on time. But taking the time to have one-on-one conversations, not only about how people are doing, but to give that kind of spot feedback that leads to growth as well, and to have those kind of career conversations, in the very beginning about, hey, welcome to Tomo. Why are you here? What do you want to get out of this? And knowing that about each engineer, so that you can you can steer opportunities toward people that help them achieve their larger career goals. And it's not rocket science, right? It's not a magic bullet or anything like that, but it's like, for me, it's the discipline and the intention, and like taking the time to make sure that those conversations happen, even if it's scrappy, right? We didn't have formal performance reviews yet. We didn't have anything, right? We were a baby company, but we can still have those conversations, and growth can still happen.
I think that is all the questions for now. Audrey, thank you so much. Yeah. Greatly appreciated. This was an awesome presentation, and a lot of good questions there.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you, everybody.